The news of the Battle of Kravik Prime spread across the galaxy within hours. Species that had considered humanity to be peaceful and non-threatening suddenly had to reassess their understanding. The humans had not just responded to the attack on the Nightingale with diplomatic protests or economic sanctions. They had deployed the largest military force in their history and delivered a crushing defeat to a major military power. Communication channels throughout known space buzzed with analysis and speculation about what this meant for galactic politics. The Verdani High Command convened an emergency session on their homeworld. The military leaders who had authorized the attack on the Nightingale as a test of human resolve now faced the consequences of their miscalculation. They had believed that humanity's humanitarian nature indicated weakness and lack of military capability. The smoking ruins of Kravik Prime proved otherwise. Intelligence reports showed that the human fleet had fought with precision and discipline, destroying military targets while carefully avoiding civilian casualties. This was not the action of a weak or soft species. Within a week of the battle, the Verdani High Command agreed to all of Earth's demands without further negotiation. The 3 ship captains who had carried out the attack on the Nightingale were formally handed over to human authorities, along with detailed records of how the attack had been planned and authorized. Reparations were calculated and payment schedules established. Most importantly, the Verdani signed a treaty, recognizing the inviolability of medical vessels and agreeing to protect such ships in their territory regardless of origin. The trials of the 3 Verdani captains were conducted on Earth with full transparency. Ambassador Nicole Perry ensured that the proceedings were broadcast throughout the galaxy so every species could witness humanity's approach to justice. The defendants were provided with legal representation and given every opportunity to present their case. Evidence was examined carefully and witnesses testified under oath. The trials took 2 months and were conducted with scrupulous attention to legal procedure and fairness. All 3 captains were found guilty of war crimes. The evidence was overwhelming and their own testimony confirmed that they had knowingly attacked an unarmed medical vessel. The sentences were significant. Life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Some human voices had called for execution, but President Catherine Walsh refused to approve death sentences. Humanity would show that justice did not require vengeance and that even those guilty of terrible crimes deserved basic dignity under the law of the galactic communities. Reaction to the trials was mixed but largely positive. Many species expressed respect for humanity's commitment to fair legal process, even when dealing with those who had murdered their citizens. A few species criticized the sentences as too lenient while others thought them too harsh. But the overall message was clear. Humanity took the protection of humanitarian workers seriously enough to go to war over it, yet was measured enough to ensure justice rather than revenge. Ambassador Nicole Perry presented a proposal to the Galactic Assembly that came to be known as the Nightingale Accords. The document established clear protocols for the protection of medical and humanitarian vessels throughout known space. Any attack on clearly marked non-combatant ships engaged in humanitarian work would be considered an act of war subject to immediate military response. Ships operating under these protections would be required to maintain certain standards and submit to verification of their status. The debate over the Nightingale Accords lasted for weeks. Some species worried that the treaty would be used as cover for military intelligence operations. Others felt it gave too much power to enforce to individual species. But the memory of what had happened to the Nightingale and the demonstration of human resolve at Kravik Prime convinced most representatives to support the measure. The accords passed with an overwhelming majority. Medical vessels now had formal protection backed by the collective military power of dozens species. Back on Earth, a massive memorial service was held for the crew of the Nightingale. Captain Elena Martinez attended in a wheelchair, still recovering from her injuries. She sat in the front row as President Walsh and Admiral Brennan spoke about each of the 214 crew members who had died. Their names were read aloud one by one, and their families came forward to receive medals honoring their sacrifice. The ceremony lasted for hours, but no one left. The entire planet seemed to pause to remember those who had died helping others, Admiral Brennan announced, during the memorial that a new class of hospital ships would be built. Each vessel would be named after one of the fallen crew members. The ships would be larger and better equipped than the Nightingale, and they would continue the mission of providing humanitarian aid throughout the galaxy. But there would be one key difference. Each hospital ship would be escorted by warships capable of protecting them from any threat. Humanity would continue to offer compassion, but never again would their medical personnel be left defenseless. The first of the new hospital ships was named the Dr. Peter Graham in honor of the chief medical officer who had died saving patients during the attack. The ship was commissioned 6 months after the battle, with Captain Frank Sullivan's daughter, Lieutenant Amy Sullivan, serving as its chief medical officer. Amy had requested the assignment, specifically wanting to carry on the work that her father had fought to protect. The Dr. Peter Graham launched with full medical facilities and a crew of 300. Relations between humanity and the Verdani settled into a cold but stable peace. Trade continued between their territories, though at reduced levels. Diplomatic channels remained open, and both sides worked to prevent further incidents. The Verdani military underwent significant reforms, with several high-ranking officers who had supported the Nightingale attack being removed from command. A new generation of Verdani leaders began to emerge who understood that humanity's compassion was a strength rather than a weakness. Commander Lucy Wright's intelligence reports showed a significant shift in how multiple species viewed humanity. Before Kravik Prime, humans had been seen as idealistic newcomers to galactic politics, peaceful and helpful, but ultimately not a major player in military terms. After Kravik Prime, their perception changed dramatically. Humanity was now recognized as a species that would defend its principles with overwhelming force when necessary, but would do so within the bounds of law and ethics. Jake Murphy continued flying combat missions for another 2 years before retiring from active duty. He never forgot his sister or the other crew members of the Nightingale. Eventually, he became an instructor at the Fighter Pilot Academy, where he taught young pilots not just about tactics and weapons, but about why they fought. He told them about the Nightingale and about the principle that medical workers deserved protection. His students carried those lessons with them throughout their careers. Lieutenant Sophie Banks recovered from her physical injuries but struggled with the psychological trauma of watching the Nightingale die. She worked with counselors and eventually found peace by volunteering to serve aboard the new hospital ships. Sophie became the chief communications officer on the UHMS Linda Hayes, ensuring that these vessels could always call for help if needed. She took comfort in knowing that the new ships would never face what the Nightingale had faced, because humanity had proven it would respond with decisive force. Captain Elena Martinez never fully recovered from her injuries and was forced to retire from active service, but she found a new purpose as an advocate for humanitarian workers throughout the galaxy. She traveled to different worlds speaking about the importance of protecting medical personnel and refugees. Her speeches were powerful reminders that behind every policy and military decision were real people trying to help others. Elena became a symbol of resilience and commitment to humanitarian values. The Calathi child that Dr. Peter Graham had been treating when the attack occurred made a full recovery. Her family learned about the doctor's sacrifice and how he had shielded her with his body during the evacuation. When she grew older, she decided to become a doctor herself, specifically studying human medicine. She wanted to honor the memory of the human who had saved her life by helping others the way he had. Her story became known throughout the galaxy as an example of how compassion creates ripples that extend far beyond the original act. 5 years after the Battle of Kravik Prime, the galactic community held a formal ceremony recognizing the crew of the Nightingale. Representatives from 40 different species gathered to honor the memory of the medical personnel who had died. A monument was erected in neutral space at the location where the ship had been destroyed. The monument bore the names of all 214 crew members and an inscription in multiple languages that read simply, "They healed the sick and comforted the suffering." Their light will never fade. Admiral Brennan retired 2 years after, Kravik Prime having served the Earth fleet for 42 years. At his retirement ceremony, he spoke about the lessons of the Nightingale incident. He said that humanity had learned it was possible to be both compassionate and strong. That helping others did not make you weak, but rather gave you something worth fighting for. The greatest military force meant nothing if it was no. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Kravik system in perfect formation. Every ship dropped into normal space within seconds of each other, exactly as planned. On the bridge of the Retribution, Admiral Charles Brennan watched the tactical display light up with contacts. The Verdani had not been expecting such a massive force, and their defense fleet was scrambling to respond. Defense Commander Zral of the Verdani military watched his sensors with growing disbelief as the scope of the human armada became clear. Zral had been confident that the humans would respond to the Nightingale incident with diplomatic protests and perhaps minor economic sanctions. The Verdani intelligence assessments had consistently described humans as soft and conflict-averse. But the force now appearing in his system was anything but soft. 47 warships, including multiple dreadnought-class vessels that outmassed anything the Verdani had in this sector. Zral immediately ordered his fleet to battle stations and sent urgent messages to the High Command requesting reinforcements. Admiral Brennan opened a communication channel, broadcasting on all frequencies so that every species monitoring this sector would hear his words. He identified himself and stated the purpose of the human fleet's presence. The Verdani had attacked the UHMS Nightingale, an unarmed medical vessel operating under the protection of galactic humanitarian law. They had killed 214 medical personnel who were helping refugees and civilians of multiple species. This attack violated every principle of civilized conduct and could not go unanswered. The Admiral continued listing Earth's demands with cold precision. The Verdani would surrender the 3 ship captains who had carried out the attack to face trial for war crimes. They would pay reparations to the families of every crew member killed. They would sign a formal treaty guaranteeing the safety of all medical vessels operating in this sector, regardless of their origin. The Verdani had 2 hours to comply with these demands or face the consequences. The message ended and silence filled the space between the fleets. Commander Zral considered his options carefully. His defense fleet numbered 70 warships, a numerical advantage over the humans. The Verdani ships were battle-tested and his crews were experienced warriors. More importantly, Verdani military doctrine taught that showing weakness invited further aggression. If he surrendered to the human demands now, his career would be over and the Verdani Confederation would lose face throughout the galaxy. Zral made his decision and rejected the ultimatum. The Verdani fleet began moving into attack formation. Admiral Brennan had expected this response. He turned to Captain Frank Sullivan and gave a single nod. Frank activated the fleet-wide tactical channel and issued the engagement order. The Battle of Kravik Prime had begun. The first wave of attack came from the carrier Valiant as Lieutenant Beth Coleman led 300 fighters into space. The small craft accelerated rapidly, forming into attack squadrons as they raced toward the Verdani fleet. Their mission was to strip away the enemy's fighter, screen and create openings for the capital. Ships. Jake Murphy flew his fighter with cold precision, targeting the Verdani interceptors that rose to meet the human attack. His weapon systems locked onto an enemy craft and he fired a burst from his plasma cannons. The Verdani fighter exploded in a ball of fire and Jake was already moving to his next target. Around him, the space battle unfolded with deadly beauty as fighters wheeled and turned, trading fire at impossible speeds. The Verdani pilots were skilled, but they had never faced human pilots fighting with this level of determination. The main fleet engagement began with a devastating opening salvo from the human dreadnoughts. The Retribution and her sister ships unleashed their railgun batteries, firing hundreds of projectiles toward the Verdani formation. The kinetic rounds traveled at tremendous velocity, crossing the distance in seconds. Several Verdani cruisers took direct hits, their shields overloading and their hulls rupturing. The Verdani returned fire with plasma weapons, but the human Formation was spread out, making it difficult to achieve concentrated hits. Commander Jason Torres led his destroyer squadron through the chaos of battle like a pack of wolves hunting larger prey. The Vengeance and her sisters were smaller and faster than the capital ships, allowing them to exploit gaps in the Verdani formation. Jason ordered his ships to target the enemy's command and control vessels, disrupting their coordination. Missiles streaked from the destroyer's tubes, each one guided by sophisticated targeting systems. 2 Verdani frigates exploded within seconds of each other as the missiles found their marks. The Verdani fleet fought back with the ferocity their species was known for. Commander Zral directed his forces to concentrate fire on the human destroyers, hoping to whittle down the faster ships before they could do more damage. Several Verdani battleships focused their plasma batteries on the UHS Hammer, scoring multiple hits. The destroyer's shields collapsed and her hull began to breach. Her captain ordered the crew to abandon ship but stayed at his post, directing damage control efforts until the last possible moment on the Retribution. Admiral Brennan watched the tactical display with the practiced eye of a veteran commander. The battle was unfolding roughly as he had predicted, though Verdani resistance was stronger than intelligence estimates had suggested. He ordered the cruiser squadron to move forward and support the destroyers while the dreadnoughts maintained their bombardment of the Verdani capital ships. Every decision had to balance achieving their objectives with minimizing human casualties. Lieutenant Beth Coleman's fighter wing had cleared most of the Verdani interceptors and now turned their attention to the enemy's larger ships. Her pilots began making attack runs on Verdani cruisers, targeting their engine sections and weapons arrays. Jake Murphy lined up his approach on a Verdani battleship, releasing his anti-ship missiles at point-blank range. The missiles punched through the weakened shields and detonated inside the ship's hull. Secondary explosions rippled through the battleship as her ammunition stores cooked off. The UHS Steadfast, commanded by Captain Mary Scott, took heavy damage when 3 Verdani cruisers concentrated fire on her position. Plasma bolts tore through her armor plating and multiple compartments vented atmosphere to space. Mary ordered emergency bulkheads sealed and rerouted all available power to the remaining weapons. Even as her ship was dying around her, the Steadfast continued to fight, firing her last missiles at the nearest Verdani vessel. The enemy cruiser was destroyed, but so was the Steadfast. Mary Scott and most of her crew died at their posts. 2 hours into the battle, the tide began to turn decisively in humanity's favor. The Verdani had lost nearly 30 ships destroyed or disabled, while the human fleet had lost 3 destroyers and suffered damage to multiple other vessels. Commander Zral watched his tactical display with growing desperation. His numerical advantage had evaporated and the human ships were proving more effective in combat than Verdani doctrine had predicted. He sent another urgent message to the High Command, but knew that reinforcements would not arrive in time. Admiral Brennan gave the order for the final phase of the operation. The remaining human ships formed up and began a systematic bombardment of Verdani military installations on Kravik Prime itself. Targeting data provided by intelligence pinpointed command centers supplied depots, shipyards, and defensive batteries. The Admiral's orders were explicit: only military targets. No attacks on civilian population centers or infrastructure. Every weapons officer double-checked their targeting solutions before firing. Railgun rounds and missiles rained down on Kravik Prime's military facilities. The main command center where the attack on the Nightingale had been planned and authorized was destroyed in the first salvo. Shipyards capable of building new Verdani warships were reduced to twisted metal. Supply depots containing ammunition and provisions for the sector fleet went up in massive explosions. The Verdani defensive batteries tried to shoot down the incoming fire but were overwhelmed by the sheer volume of ordnance. Commander Zral watched helplessly as his forces were systematically dismantled. The human fleet had not just defeated his defense force, but had effectively eliminated the Verdani military presence in this entire sector. He had underestimated humanity's capability and resolve, and now his people were paying the price. Zral broadcast an unconditional surrender, hoping to prevent further destruction. Admiral Brennan accepted the surrender and ordered his ships to cease fire. The Battle of Kravik Prime was over. The human fleet had achieved total victory. 42 Verdani warships were destroyed or disabled. The military installations on Kravik Prime were in ruins. The 3 ship captains responsible for the Nightingale attack were taken into custody along with Commanders Rawl and several other senior officers. The cost had been significant. 3 human destroyers lost. 5 other ships heavily damaged. Over 400 human crew members dead with hundreds more wounded. Admiral Brennan stood on the bridge of the Retribution and looked at the tactical display showing the aftermath of the battle. Debris floated through space marking where ships had died. Rescue operations were underway to recover survivors from both sides. The Admiral felt no joy in the victory, only a grim satisfaction that justice had been served. He opened a communication channel to the fleet. The Mars orbital shipyards had never seen anything like the mobilization that began within hours of the Council's decision. Ships that had been on routine patrols received urgent recall orders and began burning hard for the assembly point. Crews that had been on shore leave were pulled back to their vessels. Supply ships worked around the clock loading ammunition and provisions for an extended military campaign. Admiral Charles Brennan transferred his command to the UHS Retribution, a massive dreadnought-class warship that would serve as the fleet flagship. The Retribution was one of the most powerful ships humanity had ever built. Her hull was lined with heavy armor plating designed to withstand direct hits from plasma weapons. Dozens of railgun batteries protruded from her sides, capable of firing projectiles at a significant fraction of light speed. Missile tubes loaded with nuclear-tipped warheads sat ready to launch. Point defense systems covered every angle, protecting against incoming fire. Captain Frank Sullivan stood on her bridge overseeing final preparations as Admiral Brennan came aboard. Frank had commanded the UHS Valiant for 5 years before being promoted to the Retribution. The Valiant was now under the command of his former executive officer and would be joining the fleet as the primary carrier. She carried 300 strike fighters in her hangar bays along with their pilots and support crews. Each fighter was equipped with plasma cannons and anti-ship missiles, making them deadly against larger vessels. The carrier also served as a mobile repair facility capable of keeping the fleet operational during extended campaigns. Commander Jason Torres commanded a destroyer squadron that included some of the fastest ships in the fleet. The UHS Vengeance, the UHS Justice, and the UHS Hammer were sleek vessels built for speed and hitting power. Their role would be to screen the larger capital ships and hunt down any Verdani vessels that tried to flee the battle. Jason gathered his captains for a briefing aboard the Vengeance, going over tactical formations and communication protocols. Each captain understood their role and each was ready to execute it perfectly. Lieutenant Beth Coleman led the fighter wing briefings in the Valiant's ready rooms. Beth had been flying combat missions for 8 years and had more confirmed kills than any other pilot in the fleet. Now she stood before 200 pilots explaining the mission parameters and rules of engagement. Military targets only. No attacks on civilian infrastructure. No pursuit of fleeing ships beyond the battle zone. Every pilot in the room wore a black armband in honor of the Nightingale's fallen crew. Among them was Jake Murphy, whose sister had been a nurse aboard the medical ship. Jake sat in the back of the ready room listening to Beth's briefing, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing his sister's face, remembering the last time they had talked before she shipped out on the Nightingale. She had been so excited about the mission, talking about all the people she would help and the difference she would make. Now she was gone, killed by an enemy that did not value mercy or compassion. Jake's hands tightened on his flight helmet. He would make them pay for what they had done. As ships continued to arrive at the assembly point, the size of the fleet became apparent. 47 warships in total, including 5 dreadnoughts, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 19 support vessels. It was the largest military force Earth had ever deployed, and its purpose was singular. Captain Greg Patterson of the UHS Defender watched the fleet formation from his bridge and felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. This was humanity's moment to show the galaxy who they really were. Admiral Brennan called a meeting of all ship captains via secure communications. His face appeared on screens throughout the fleet as he addressed the assembled commanders. He reminded them that they were not going to war for conquest or revenge. They were going to deliver justice for the murder of innocent medical personnel. Their actions would be measured and proportional. They would strike military targets with overwhelming force, but they would not harm civilians or engage in acts of cruelty. The galaxy would watch this operation and judge humanity by how they conducted themselves. The Admiral continued explaining the strategic importance of the mission. Kravik Prime was the Vordani's forward military base in this sector. It housed their regional command center, supply depots, and repair facilities. It was also where the 3 ships that attacked the Nightingale had returned after completing their mission. Intelligence reports confirmed that the commanders responsible for ordering the attack were currently stationed at the base. By striking Kravik Prime, humanity would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. While the Admiral spoke, messages of support began arriving from unexpected sources. Civilian vessels that had been helped by the Nightingale over the years broadcast their gratitude and solidarity. A Kelethi merchant ship sent a message specifically mentioning the child that Dr. Peter Graham had saved and expressing sorrow for his death. Even some alien species governments quietly offered intelligence about Verdani fleet movements and defensive capabilities. The Nightingale's humanitarian work had created goodwill across the galaxy, and now that goodwill was manifesting as support for Earth's response. The fleet spent 36 hours in final preparations before departure. Engineers conducted last-minute checks on weapon systems and engines. Medical bays were stocked with supplies for treating combat casualties. Marines prepared their equipment in case boarding actions became necessary. Throughout the fleet, crews wrote final messages to their families, knowing that some of them might not return. The mood was somber but determined. Every person understood what they were fighting for. Lieutenant Sophie Banks, who had survived the Nightingale attack, was aboard the Retribution as a communications officer. Admiral Brennan had specifically requested her presence, wanting someone who had witnessed the attack firsthand to be part of the response. Sophie had been hesitant at first, still dealing with the trauma of watching her ship destroyed and her friends killed. But she had accepted the assignment, knowing that she owed it to the fallen crew to see this through. Captain Elena Martinez was recovering in a medical facility on Mars, but she sent a recorded message to the fleet that Admiral Brennan played for all crews. Elena's face was still bandaged from her injuries, but her voice was strong. She thanked the fleet for honoring her crew's sacrifice and reminded them that the Nightingale had stood for the best of humanity. Now the fleet had a chance to show that humanity would defend those values with the same courage that the medical ship's crew had shown. Her words resonated throughout every ship. As the final countdown began, Admiral Brennan walked through the corridors of the Retribution, stopping to speak with crew members at their stations. He shook hands with young ensigns and veteran officers, alike thanking them for their service and reminding them of their duty. Frank Sullivan watched his admiral connect with the crew and understood why. Charles Brennan was considered one of the finest commanders in the fleet. He led not just with strategy and tactics, but with genuine care for the people under his command. The fleet formed into its jump formation with the dreadnoughts at the center, surrounded by cruisers and destroyers in defensive positions. The carrier Valiant took a protected position in the rear where her fighters could launch quickly if needed. Support ships clustered together, ready to provide logistics and medical assistance during and after the battle. Every vessel ran final systems checks and reported ready status to the flagship. Admiral Brennan gave the order, and the fleet jumped to hyperspace. 47 ships vanished from Mars orbit, simultaneously leaving behind only the distortion of folded space. Their destination was the Kravik system, 6 days' travel away at maximum hyperspace velocity. During that journey, the crews would rest and prepare mentally for the coming battle. They would also receive continuous intelligence updates about Verdani, fleet positions, and defensive preparations. On the Retribution's bridge, Frank Sullivan looked at the swirling colors of hyperspace through the main viewport. Beside him, Admiral Brennan stood silently contemplating what lay ahead. The old admiral knew that the next few days would determine not just the outcome of a single battle, but the future of humanity's place among the stars. They were committed now to a course of action that could not be reversed. All they could do was execute their plan with precision and honor the memory of those who had died aboard the Nightingale. The distress signal from the Nightingale reached Earthfleet Command 7 minutes after the attack ended. Admiral Charles Brennan was reviewing supply reports when his aide burst into the office with the emergency transmission. Charles ordered it played immediately and watched in growing horror as the events unfolded on his screen. The footage from the Nightingale's black box showed everything. The peaceful medical ship drifting through neutral space. The Verdani warships approaching. The repeated broadcasts of medical status and non-combatant identification. Then the plasma bolts tearing through the hull with brutal efficiency. Charles Brennan had served in the Earth Fleet for 40 years. He had fought in 3 wars and countless border skirmishes. He had seen death and destruction in many forms. But this was different. This was not a battle between military forces or even a tragic accident. This was murder. The deliberate targeting of unarmed medical personnel who were helping anyone regardless of their species. The Admiral's hands shook as he reached for the emergency communication system. Within minutes he had contacted every member of the United Earth Council, demanding an immediate session. The council chamber filled quickly as representatives arrived from around the world. President Catherine Walsh took her seat at the head of the table, her face grave. Ambassador Nicole Perry stood to present the evidence and her voice trembled with barely controlled rage. She showed the council members the footage from the Nightingale and listed the names of every crew member who had died. Doctors and nurses, engineers and pilots, people who had dedicated their lives to helping others. All killed without mercy or warning. Secretary General Victor Lane was the first to speak after the presentation ended. His words were simple and direct. This attack demanded an immediate military response. The Verdani could not be allowed to commit such an atrocity without consequences. But Ambassador Henry Morgan raised his hand asking for caution. He reminded the Council that the Verdani Confederation was a powerful military force backed by several allied species. A direct confrontation could escalate into a full-scale war that would cost millions of lives. Across multiple worlds, the debate began in earnest with representatives arguing from all sides. Some called for economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure. Others demanded that the Verdani leadership be brought before the Galactic Court to face war crimes charges. A few voices suggested that humanity should respond with overwhelming military force to send a clear message that such attacks would never be tolerated. The arguments grew heated as the hours passed and no consensus emerged. Commander Lucy Wright from Naval Intelligence was called to give her assessment of the situation. She walked to the front of the chamber carrying a datapad filled with information her analysts had gathered. Lucy explained that the attack on the Nightingale was not a random act or the decision of a rogue commander. Her intelligence sources indicated that the Verdani High Command had authorized the attack as a deliberate test of human resolve. They wanted to see if humanity would back down when confronted with violence or if humans would truly fight for their principles. Lucy continued her briefing, explaining that the Verdani leadership viewed human compassion and humanitarian efforts as signs of weakness. They believed that any species willing to help others without expecting military advantage was naive and vulnerable. The attack on the Nightingale was meant to prove this theory. If humanity responded with only diplomatic protests, the Verdani would conclude that humans could be pushed around. If humanity responded with military force, the Verdani believed they could win a war through superior numbers and alliances. President Walsh listened carefully to all the arguments and intelligence reports. She understood the weight of the decision before her. Whatever action Earth took now would define humanity's place in the galactic community for generations to come. If they did nothing meaningful, the Nightingale's crew would have died for nothing and other species would see humans as weak. If they responded too aggressively, they might start a war that could devastate multiple civilizations. The president needed to find a response that was both just and strategic. Admiral Brennan appeared on the main screen via remote Communication from Fleet Command. His weathered face showed the strain of the past hours, but his voice was steady and clear. He informed the Council that he had taken the liberty of beginning fleet mobilization procedures. Ships were already being recalled from patrol duties and supplied for extended operations. The Admiral was not asking permission. He was telling the Council that the military was ready to act and awaiting orders. The room fell silent as everyone processed what the Admiral had said. Some Council members looked angry at this presumption, but others nodded in approval. Charles Brennan continued speaking, laying out a military plan he called Operation Righteous Fury. The objective would not be to invade Verdani territory or destroy their civilization. Instead, the Earth fleet would strike at the Verdani military stronghold at Kravik Prime. This was the forward operating base from which the attack ships had launched and where the commanders responsible were stationed. The Admiral explained that a targeted military strike would achieve several goals. First, it would punish those directly responsible for the attack. Second, it would demonstrate that humanity possessed both the capability and the will to defend its principles. Third, it would send a message to other species that attacking human medical or humanitarian vessels would result in severe consequences. And fourth, it would be proportional, enough that it might not trigger a full-scale war while still being devastating enough to make the Verdani think twice about future aggression. President Walsh asked for a vote from the Council members. The chamber was tense as each representative cast their decision. Some voted yes immediately, while others took longer to consider. When the final count came and the result was clear, by a margin of 2/3, the Council had authorized military action against the Verdani installation at Kravik Prime. The President stood and made the authorization official. Operation Righteous Fury was approved. Admiral Brennan saluted through the screen and immediately cut the connection. He had work to do and very little time to do it. The largest battle fleet in human history needed to be assembled and prepared for combat. Every ship would need to be supplied with ammunition and provisions. Every crew member would need to understand the mission and the rules of engagement. This would not be a war of extermination or revenge. It would be a precise military operation designed to achieve specific objectives while minimizing civilian casualties. President Walsh addressed the remaining Council members after the Admiral left. She reminded them all that the coming days would test humanity like never before. The eyes of the galaxy would be watching to see how Earth responded to this atrocity. They needed to show strength without cruelty, justice without excess, determination without blind rage. The Nightingale's crew had died believing in humanity's better nature. The response to their deaths needed to honor that belief while still delivering consequences to those responsible. Ambassador Nicole Perry was given the task of preparing a formal statement to be broadcast to all species in the known galaxy. The message would explain what had happened and what humanity intended to do about it. It would make clear that medical vessels were sacred under human protection and that attacking them was an act of war. The statement would be diplomatic but firm, reasonable but unwavering. Nicole spent the next hours crafting every word, knowing that this message would shape galactic opinion about humanity for years to come. The HMS Nightingale floated peacefully through the neutral zone between human and alien territories. The massive white ship bore the Red Cross symbol on all sides, making it clear to anyone watching that this was a medical vessel. Captain Elena Martinez stood on the bridge watching the stars drift by as her crew went about their duties. She had commanded the Nightingale for 3 years now, and every day she felt proud of the work they did. The ship carried 200 medical personnel, including doctors and nurses and technicians who had volunteered to help anyone in need regardless of their species or origin. Dr. Peter Graham walked through the medical bay checking on his patients. The chief medical officer had treated hundreds of aliens from dozens of different species during his time aboard the Nightingale. Right now he was looking after a small Kelethi child who had been suffering from radiation poisoning after her colony was caught in a border skirmish. The little girl's scales were turning a healthier shade of blue, and Peter smiled knowing she would make a full recovery. Nurse Linda Hayes came up beside him with a datapad showing the latest readings. Everything looked good, and they expected to return the child to her family within the week. On the bridge, Lieutenant Kyle Bennett was monitoring the navigation systems when his console started beeping. 3 ships had just entered scanner range and they were moving fast. He reported to Captain Martinez immediately, and she ordered him to identify the vessels. Within seconds, the computer gave them an answer. Verdani warships. Elena felt her stomach tighten. The Verdani were a reptilian species known for their aggressive military tactics, and they had been causing problems along the human border for months. But surely they would not attack a hospital ship. Lieutenant Sophie Banks moved to the communications console and opened all channels broadcasting their medical status. She transmitted the universal symbols for non-combatant vessels and repeated their identity as a humanitarian ship protected under galactic law. The Nightingale was unarmed and posed no threat to anyone. Sophie waited for a response, but none came. The 3 Verdani ships continued to approach at attack speed. Elena ordered the crew to prepare for evasive maneuvers, even though she knew the hospital ship was too slow to outrun warships. The first plasma bolt hit the Nightingale without warning. The entire ship shuddered as the blast tore through the outer hull near the main medical bay. Alarms screamed throughout every corridor and the lights flickered as power systems strained to compensate. Elena grabbed her command chair to steady herself and immediately ordered all hands to evacuation stations. Another blast hit the ship, this time penetrating deeper into the crew quarters. Fires erupted in 3 sections and the automatic systems struggled to contain them. Dr. Peter Graham was thrown to the floor when the first blast hit. The Kellethy child screamed in terror as medical equipment crashed around them. Peter got to his feet and grabbed the child, wrapping her in a protective blanket. Linda Hayes was already moving other patients toward the escape pods, but there were too many injured people and not enough time. Another explosion rocked the ship and part of the ceiling collapsed. Peter shielded the child with his body as debris rained down around them. Down in engineering, Danny Pierce worked frantically to keep the life support systems running. The ship's main power core was damaged and bleeding energy, but if he could just hold it together for a few more minutes, the crew might have a chance to evacuate. Sparks flew from the control panels and the temperature in the engine room was rising to dangerous levels. Denny knew he was running out of time, but he refused to leave his post. Every second he bought was another life that might be saved. The Verdani ships continued their assault, firing methodically at different sections of the Nightingale. It was clear they were not trying to disable the ship, but to destroy it completely. Captain Elena Martinez broadcast a final distress signal giving their position and what was happening. She reported that they were a medical vessel under unprovoked attack and that casualties were mounting. Then another plasma bolt struck the bridge and the communications array exploded. Elena was thrown across the room, slamming into the wall. Blood ran down her face, but she forced herself to stay conscious. Kyle Bennett helped his captain to her feet, and together they made their way to the nearest escape pod. Behind them, the bridge was filling with smoke and the control panels were sparking and dying one by one. Sophie Banks was already at the pod helping injured crew members get inside. She looked at Elena with fear in her eyes, but also determination. They had all known the risks when they signed up for this mission, but none of them had expected this. In the medical bay, Peter Graham carried the Kellethy child toward the escape pods, while Linda Hayes supported an injured Tarkonian patient. The corridor was filled with smoke and the emergency lights cast everything in a red glow. They could hear the screams of people trapped in other sections and the groan of metal as the ship's structure began to fail. Peter knew they would not be able to save everyone, but he refused to give up. He reached an escape pod and placed the child inside, then went back for more patients. Danny Pierce watched his instruments as the power core began to fail. He had done everything he could, but the damage was too severe. The core would breach in less than 2 minutes. He activated the emergency containment fields, hoping to buy a few more seconds, then he ran for the nearest escape pod. But he never made it. The power core exploded, sending a shockwave through the entire engineering section. Danny Pierce died instantly, giving his life so that others might live. The escape pods launched from the dying Nightingale like seeds scattered in the wind. Captain Elena Martinez watched from her pod as the ship that had been her home broke apart. Fires burned across the hull, and atmosphere vented from dozens of breaches. The Verdani ships held their position, watching the destruction they had caused. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they turned and jumped to hyperspace, leaving the survivors floating in the wreckage. Elena activated her pod's emergency beacon and took stock of who had made it out. Reports came in from other pods, and her heart sank with each one. 97 crew members were confirmed dead. Another 23 were missing and presumed killed. The Nightingale was gone. 214 people had been aboard the ship when the attack began. Only 94 had survived. Elena closed her eyes and wept for her fallen crew. Then she opened a channel to Earth and sent a message that would change everything. The Verdani had just made the biggest mistake in their species' history.